This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. The subject is Carnival of Souls, the B film horror classic from the 1960s. I have two film critics who will be discussing it, if it is a great film or not, and the conversation will begin in a moment. The subject is Carnival of Souls, a 1962 low-budget classic from Herc Harvey, a one-time film director, and it's considered one of the most influential horror films and one of the most influential B films of all time. On the left of the screen, there is Matt Brunson. He is a writer, and are you the founder of Film Frenzy as well?
Yes, that's correct. I've been working for a long time as the film critic for an alternative weekly in Charlotte called Creative Loafing until it went belly up. And I've done other freelancing too and syndication. But yes, now I'm doing Film Frenzy, which is my own website.
And let me just then ask, do you have a particular interest in horror or B films, or is it just something like Carnival of Souls, something that you have just always enjoyed?
I've always considered my favorite genres to be horror and film noir, but I have to quantify horror by saying classic horror because, like, I don't like a lot of the torture porn and a lot of modern horror, but I just love classic horror movies.
Yeah, I know Carnival of Souls. I think Harvey said he was trying to go for a Bergman-like effect with Val Lewton, was it, or something like that? But anyway, Peter, let me turn to Peter on the right of screen. Peter Wilshire. He teaches in Australia. So, Peter, if you could give a little background about yourself, also your film aesthetic, and then talk a little bit because you have said that you think it is a great genre film, but not necessarily a great film. So, a little background about yourself.
Yeah, sure. Look, Dan, thanks a lot for inviting me on. It's a great pleasure to be here, and particularly speaking to you guys. I teach, as just mentioned before, I teach film and media and other subjects as well, but predominantly in the media and film area at Deakin University in Melbourne here, bleak Melbourne at this point in time. I wrote an article, as you're probably aware, quite a long time ago now on Carnival of Souls, so I had to kind of look it up yesterday because I'd sort of was trying to remember what actually how I actually wrote about it. But look, I consider it a great cult film. But as we just sort of mentioned, in terms of being a sort of a masterpiece or anything, I think you've got to sort of clarify that and maybe put it in a bit of context. And there's some clunkiness to it. It's a very, very low budget film, as we all know, but it certainly holds an enduring fascination and continues to do that. And there are various reasons why I think that is, and I guess we'll discuss them as we go along. So just as a matter of interest, maybe, I was talking to my mother yesterday. Now, my mother saw Carnival of Souls here in Melbourne, so it must have got a cinema release of some kind here. So we're talking about around about 1962. Yeah. And she still remembers it. She's never forgotten it. And it had an endearing, left an endearing impression on her. And there's various reasons for that, but we'll get to them, I guess, a bit later. So, and certainly, nearly 60 years later, it has this fascination, certainly for me and many other people as well.
Well, one of the things about it that made it, as you say, a cult film is that, like It's a Wonderful Life and like the later Night of the Living Dead, where it clearly has an influence on, it fell into public domain, at least in the U.S., which allowed it for many years to be seen endlessly at night on things like Creature Feature and various horror shows.
Yeah. I think, actually, just before I get to that, just quickly, I was just trying to remember exactly when I first heard about Carnival of Souls. And it may indeed have been an article I read on the film, probably in the mid-90s, an article here in Melbourne. And that was to do with a screening at the Melbourne Film Festival of Carnival of Souls, which I never got a chance to go to, but that sort of piqued my interest, I think. But I think I'd heard of the title before that, maybe because of my mother mentioning it, but I hadn't seen it. But I think the article was something around, this is sort of a classic cult film, and it has this eerie sort of dreamlike quality about it. And has an endearing quality about it. So that's kind of where I came into Carnival Souls, probably about 25 years ago or something. And I may have seen it on TV after that, again here, late night TV. And then, of course, as you mentioned, it was sort of resurrected and revitalised in the late 80s, many years after the fact. So, yeah, I mean, I think there's certain reasons why it is an enduring film. I mean, obviously, the visual style, we'll get to that, I'm sure, the organ score. But even more than that, its narrative for a low-budget horror film, and that's the context, really. Its narrative is quite complex, I think, and it offers no easy explanations. It makes the audience think. There's no particular, well, you can come to a variety of conclusions about what this film is about, and I think that's the essence of Carnival of Soul to me. That's why it's so enduring. Yes, for the visual and aesthetic and sound, but because of its fractured narrative, I think that is the key to its enduring fascination, certainly for me.
Yeah.
And I was one of the many who saw it on late night television at the age of 13, and I've never been scared. I love horror movies, but I've never been scared of them or unnerved really. And that one, when I saw it at 13, and there's this one scene that it just sends a chill up my spine, and I was like, what is this? And it really did unnerve me. And then it wasn't, and I didn't even appreciate the whole movie as a whole at that point. But when I got older and then started revisiting it, I think it's a really good movie. It's one of those that, as I mentioned, it's like Night of the Living Dead and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, where because it's a low budget movie, because it has this gritty aesthetic, amateurish acting and all this, it gives it this raw, gritty feel that adds to the atmosphere that a lot of the, bigger budget fantasy films from the late 60s, early 70s, they didn't have. Something like The Omega Man looks, ridiculous and cheesy now. But these movies are kind of outside of time, these gritty black and white ones, because they just have this aura about them that it can't be pinpointed in time.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, mate. I totally agree with what you're saying. And I mean, when I say it's not a masterpiece, what I mean is that there's clunkiness to it and some clunky dialogue and editing, but that's part of its enduring quality as well, because people look at it as a low budget horror film, and that's what it is. But I think it's an unconventional low-budget horror film because it has quite a complex narrative, as I said before. And you can interpret Carnival of Souls in a variety of ways. Now, that's unusual for a low-budget horror film. There's a level of complexity there, I think, anyway. Mm. And the article I wrote, which is way back in 2007, now I just had a pull out yesterday, I approached the film as a dream that the main character, Mary Henry, was having from the point of the, we'll get to this, I guess, but the car accident at the beginning of the film and the end of the film. There's kind of a symmetry too between the early scene, the scene when, she's comes out of the river bedraggled, but strangely not wet, which is interesting. We'll maybe get to that. Her hair is not wet. And it could indeed be interpreted, as I have interpreted the film, as a dream that she's having in the split second between death. And that's one way of looking at it, which I think is quite fascinating. And there are other films, too, that have that notion, which I'm sure you're aware of and maybe get to. An episode of the Twilight Zone called The Hitchhiker, for example. Anyway, so I think that's really its enduring quality, and certainly has that aesthetic, fantastic and all that. And it's has been inspiring for many filmmakers and young filmmakers as well, because look what can be achieved with, was it $30,000 US or something? In 1962, that wasn't much. And look what they've been able to achieve, first time feature director and all that sort of stuff. But it's the narrative. It's the narrative, too, that I think it holds the fascination, really.
Well, it's the fact that there are so many different ways you can interpret this. As you say, there's the whole dream aspect. Is it a
Yeah.
dream? It's the whole thing of her, like, she dies at the beginning, and then the whole thing is like that moment before death, and also like an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. Which is very reminiscent of. But then there's other things like, is it not a dream, not her death? Is it like she's trapped in some sort of purgatory? Is she between the living world and the dead world? Which, they kind of touch upon with the fact that there's scenes where people can't hear her or see her. So there's definitely a lot of levels, and it's one of those that there's no easy answer, obviously. It's not like, oh, this is exactly what he meant by it. It's the vague stuff that I think adds to its fascination. And some of the stuff with it was happy accidents, like the organ. Like, that is such a major player in the movie. The organ music. You think, oh, they must have planned that from the start. I read that what happened was they found an organ place that would let them film their Chief, and they thought, great, we'll put this in the movie. And it worked so perfectly in the movie with the whole religious Christian allegories and such. So, like I say, happy accident.
Yeah, the very first film I did in this series was on La Dolce Vita, which also has a scene with the organs, with someone playing organs in it too. And so it's interesting that they touch upon a lot of that spiritual stuff too. But I want to get back something, Matt, you said early on about horror porn of today, and I think one of the things that's missing from a lot of so-called horror films today is the actual element of horror. I did a show on monster movies and horror movies about 2 or 3 years ago, a pair of almost 3-hour-long shows. And one of the things I said was, horror isn't just cutting off heads and doing this and that. Horror is that something is slightly off in the world. And I gave the example then, I'll give it now. The old Laurel and Hardy film, Babes in Toyland, where they have those odd-looking characters that are sort of like Mickey Mouse, but like a Mickey Mouse from a horror dream. And they have the boogeymen with the back flaps from their underwear, hanging off. The unreal. What really scares me, or most people, I think, is something seemingly real, but a little bit off. And I think a film like this and Night of the Living Dead achieve that because of the low budget. It actually works in its favor because you don't have this CGI that is in 20 years is going to be very unconvincing. It actually plays like a dream. So what do you think about that, Matt?
Yeah, the whole dream allegory is fascinating, and how he uses minimal, as you say, no CGI, obviously, but like, this movie really doesn't have special effects. It has like a few wavy lines, and the makeup on the ghouls, especially the main ghoul played by the director.
Herc Harvey.
Herc Harvey. I was going to say Herc Harvey, but yes, Herc Harvey. So it shows how you can get this hallucinatory, dreamlike state without having to apply on a lot of weird sets and all that. Because that's what's fascinating about this movie, is like everything in this movie is so mundane. I mean, you're filming in Kansas, you're filming in Utah. There's it's gas stations, it's churches. There's nothing really except for the pavilion, which is what gave the director idea in the first place when he drove by. Just like, this is going to be a great place for a movie. Except for that setting, which is very unique, the rest of the movie is just boring locations, boarding house and all that. But throughout the whole movie, every one of these places is just almost terrifying. Whether it's because of the people there, like that creepy lecherous guy that is
Mr.
always
Linden.
hitting on her at the boarding house, or because of the ghouls, it's just unsettling all the way through.
Yeah, that one scene with his eye looking through the keyhole.
That's interesting you say that about the eye. You may be aware of this, Dan, that the great Sidney Berger, who played that particular role, the lecherous role, one of his anecdotes was that, you've got that, large close-up of his eye looking at Mary through the keyhole or through the door that's open ajar. Well, he was blind in that eye. That's his left eye. He was actually blind in that eye from birth. So there's a certain irony there.
Yeah.
The eye that they're actually filming, he actually couldn't see through. So, but later on, he's no longer with us now, unfortunately. But he was a theatre director, I think, for many years, and he would always be, teased and chided by students for playing that lecherous role, and. can never kind of live it down. But I think he appreciated it as well. But yeah, that blindness in the one eye, it's kind of, but that adds to the oddity of the whole film. As just,
I want to bring up
about it's off kilter, really.
I want to bring up a point before we start talking about the plot and getting more in depth in the things like the musical score and whatnot. But you mentioned, Peter, the Twilight Zone episode, The Hitchhiker, and two other antecedents come to mind for me. One is, Matt, you probably know the film noir Detour, about picking a stranger up, and then also Hitchcock's Strangers on a Train, where the characters are in motion constantly, always running from something, and this is where he meets a psychopath, the main character. So I think there are some elements taken from those two films, plus the Twilight Zone episode you mentioned there. So if I don't know, if just toss it out to you guys to chew around.
Well, I think it's interesting. This movie's kind of like in between A and B movies, because Herc Harvey has stated that the inspiration were filmmakers like Ingmar Bergman and all that. So he definitely wanted to do European art house sensibility. But then when you think of it, it's a B movie, and it inspired other B movies like Night of the Living Dead. But then it went beyond that to inspire people like David Lynch, who's makes these big, expensive, very weird movies. So I think it's kind of funny, the lineage between going back. Going from A to B and back to A again.
Yeah, another film I'd like to just throw in. It's a completely different film narratively, but I think that you can make comparisons in some ways. And in terms of the dream element, is Point Blank. I don't know whether you've seen John Borman's great film Point Blank, 1967, and that deals with a character played by Lee Marvin called Walker, who appears to be shot and is dying at the beginning of the film at Alcatraz. And then the remainder of the film, I mean, it could be construed as kind of this dreamlike, or this dream that this character of Walker is having before he appears to finally die at the end of the film. I mean, you can look at Point Blank as a straight crime revenge thriller, but I've written on that film too, Point Blank, it's a terrific film, and that has this strange kind of disjointed, dreamlike quality about it as well. Very different film from a low-budget horror like Carnival of Souls, but you could apply, I think, that dreamlike sort of narrative to Point Blank as well. That's a fascinating film, I think. But
so let's talk a little bit about the actual A to B narrative of the film, and we've talked a little bit about some of the main points there. But basically, it starts off with what seems to be a hot rod chase, and these people must be really stupid, because there's no way two cars could fit on that bridge at once. One of them's going to die, it seems. And
part of the off-kilterness of the film, isn't it? Really, yeah. Nothing really adds up. Makes sense. Yeah, it's a good point you make. Very much, Dan. And the lip syncing at the beginning of the film between various characters kind of lurking around the bridge, and whether that's just the amateurish nature of it, which probably would have been the case, but it sort of adds to the otherworldliness of it as well.
And it sort of begins in medias res. It begins in medias res. It's like, oh, we know why these characters are here. Why are they hot rodding? Why are 3 girls in the hot rod, going to be in this race? It seems to make no sense whatsoever.
At time is not made clear. I think there may be a mention of something like 3 hours later when Mary sort of emerges bedraggled from the river, but time is never really made clear during the film. That's kind of very dreamlike as well, that aspect of it. So this is, I think, all part of its enduring fascination, really.
Matt, what do you take about the opening of the film? It's in medias res beginning.
I think I don't see this addressed that much, I don't think, but one thing that interests me about the movie is the whole male-female dichotomy. And it starts off with these, jerks in a car, thinking, oh, we're going to, beat these women in a race. And then from there, basically, except for like the gas station attendant or somebody, every man in this is pretty condescending. Even the ones you think of as good people. The priest, he throws her out of the church when he doesn't like her new melodies, instead of trying to reform her or help her. And then, there's the creepy, guy living with her. And then there's the doctor who even says like, oh, well, I'm not really, what's he say? Something like, I'm not a professional, or I'm not a psychologist or something. But then he's like giving her all this advice. So all these men are always like lurking around her and treating her with condescension. And in a way, when you think about it, the ghoul, the one you're supposed to be the most scared of, basically is the most decent, because he's just trying to bring her, if you believe the whole, trying to get her to her death, he's just trying to bring her to where she belongs. He has no other ulterior motives or anything. So I think that's a fascinating aspect of the movie. It's that.
The ghoul, or the man, his motives are very straightforward. I mean, if you look at it from that dreamlike perspective and or that nightmarish perspective, it's a good point actually, Matt. I hadn't thought about the gender angle really. Although I thought about Dr. Samuels obviously being well, of course, Dr. Samuels later on is not what he seems, because he appears to, Mary appears to be in his office, but of course, Dr. Samuels has his back to us, the audience, that swivels around, and of course, it's the man. But I mean, that's a really good aspect. So that's another element to the film, really. And there are a variety of elements, and going back to, I guess, what we were saying before, that's part of its intrigue and fascination, And you can construe a scene towards the end of the film as a dream within a dream. So let me explain. So if you consider this film as a dream or a nightmare that Mary Henry is having in the split second between life and death, then there is a scene where you could construe it as a dream within a dream. Okay, so she's fleeing now. She's been accused of by a priest of sacrilegious organ playing, and so she's fled that situation. She's on the road, but she stops at a garage to get her car fixed. Its kind of car's hauled up. She's just waiting inside. She's too scared to go outside. She's still inside the car. And then sort of from the corner of the garage, a dark garage, the door opens slightly, and then the man appears. And she screams, jumps out of the car. You see her running through the streets of Kansas. Then she comes across the Dr. Samuels for no apparent reason. He just happens to be in that park. And then that segues into the scene at the bus depot, which is, again, there was an earlier scene too when she's trying on a dress in a store where only she can hear what's going on. No one seems to be able to hear her. Then from the bus scene, all of a sudden there's a cut and she's back in the car on the hydraulic hoist again. So you could construe that, or write that in the article, as a dream within a dream. So there's a layer. There is a layer to the narrative, which is quite complex, I think. That's one way of looking.
That also, at the very end, I mean, this is the scene that you're thinking, did they plan this out, or is this one of those little mistakes that makes a movie more interesting? Is that, okay, everything that happens is probably her all through her mind right before she dies. Then how do you explain, at the end, all Samuels and police and whoever finding those footprints of hers, which is like a scene that wouldn't be in her memories. So again, that's the sort of thing like, was that planned? Did they just think it'd be a cool ending? It doesn't matter, because it adds to the fascination of this movie. It gives you more theories to spin off and discuss. And to me, that's always a sign of a really good movie, really interesting movie.
Absolutely.
I mean, I think you could go even further and say that Mary maybe is in one of what they call a fugue state throughout the whole film. Maybe the whole film is her fearful projection of what might happen if she goes through with this insane race over that small rickety bridge. And because, I mean, she seems to, even when she's not detached and she's wandering around no one can see her, she clearly has some mental issues. I mean, she's someone, even Lyndon, the creep, seems to get that she is not quite all there. She may be a beautiful woman or whatnot, but even he's like, I don't want any part of you.
Mm-hmm. And that's the other fascinating thing in this movie is the whole religious aspect of it, because here you have a woman who is church organist, you think, wow, she must be really, God-fearing woman, and she's not. She just says it's a paying job, and that even like freaks out the creepy guy. He's like, what? And so I think the whole thing is kind of like, you could look at it as kind of a battle for her soul too, as one of the more side plots, because they're telling her, oh, you need more soul, and she clearly doesn't have it, at least in terms of playing an organ for a Christian organization. So I think that's one of the fascinating dichotomies of, is she somebody they're trying to save, that beyond saving, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, definitely. Hence the title Carnival of Souls. Yeah. Mary Henry appears to have no soul, no spirituality. I think maybe a possible weakness, I don't know, or maybe not. But the film, as it does digress in the scenes with Sidney Berger, John Linden, the lecherous guy living across the other apartment from her, and that maybe slows the pace of the film down a bit. However, it also kind of, I think, is a good thing in some ways, because it expands a bit on Mary Henry's psychology, her personality. So the film Carnival of Souls, I think, can be looked upon as sort of a bit of a deep dive to some degree into Mary Henry's psychology, what's happening in her head. And, that's exemplified by these scenes where she seems to hear these voices, as in the bus terminal, this otherworldly announcement, but nobody can hear or see her. So I think that maybe is an element of the film where the film is attempting to go inside Mary's head, her psychology, her brittle mind, if you like, or disturbed mind.
Well, there was a film that came out 5 years later, Roman Polanski's Repulsion, where Catherine Deneuve plays a character who turns out to be a murderess, a double murderess. But there are some scenes that, if you look at the face of Hillegos versus Deneuve, they're in that same kind of thing. So that makes you think, well, is this maybe a dream by the death, the spiritual thing? But maybe it's just all that this is a very disturbed woman, and the thing, her inability to relate with men, since we're not behind her eyes, but she is the main character. Maybe there's some sexual trauma in her past or something. That's a modern interpretation.
That's a good theory, because everybody describes her as frigid, but look who she's dealing with.
Yeah.
I mean, this big guy. And it's interesting how a lot of the movie she's like, I don't want to be around people. I'm obviously a loner, which is fine. She's just an introvert. But then when the things start getting weird and all that, she's even willing to hang around with the jerk, totally changing her whole attitude on that.
Well, yeah, she literally says to him, he says, "You're cold." He said, "No, I want to be with you," or something like, "I really want to be with you," which he's, and then he goes, "Well, and my wife's favorite line from the movie is, 'Hey, don't use those big words on me. I'm just a guy who works in a warehouse.'"
but I think that those lines are interesting in the context of the film, but because I think that's a way of kind of expanding Mary's character a bit. That maybe or maybe not, I'm not quite sure that Herc Harvey had this in mind, that, she's such a detached character for most of the film that maybe these scenes with Sidney Berger, where there's, a couple of scenes there where she seems to have some kind of human quality, short-lived. Maybe that's a way of kind of drawing the audience towards her character a bit more as well. I think that's just a theory of mine. Because there are a couple of scenes there where she seems to have, I wasn't going to say normal, but almost kind of normal. There's a bit of a human quality there, but it's short-lived. So she seems to brighten up a bit. There's not really a connection between them, but maybe momentarily there's a slight connection, or she's just going along with him anyway because maybe she's frightened of him. She doesn't really know what to do. She can't connect with anybody else anyway. So yeah.
Sympathetic character. I've read pieces where they're like, oh, she's so off-putting and all that. But again, when you see the people she has to deal with, and assuming, like, if you want to pretend, she survived the car crash. There's a traumatic event. So I mean, I felt my sympathies with her the whole time. It was never like, I don't like this woman. I just felt bad for the circumstances that she kept finding her, and often through no fault of her own.
And that,
I agree. I don't find any problems connecting with Mary Henry's character at all. But
and there's, going back to monster movies, there's always the sense that the real monsters are always humans, and that makes, if you flip that on its head, the ghouls are basically more sympathetic to her. They want her, whereas the rest of humanity seems to be rejecting her. So if this isn't a last second of life dream, it gets you thinking psychologically, well, what are the ghouls? What are they, a manifestation of some psychosis, some trauma of Mary's in the past? Or what are they, if they are not demonic or, supernatural things?
I mean, also with Mary, the biggest fascination she has in the whole film was with the salt air.
Yeah.
Dilapidated amusement park, and she's continually drawn back to that. And that's really the only time that she has a connection, I think, really with anything else in the film or anybody else in the film, is this connection she has or appears to have with the with salt air, So, and there's reasons why she might have that connection in terms of,
it's interesting too. It just came to me when you talk about that. She is drawn to that salt air pavilion much in the same way as the Jack Nicholson character is drawn to the hotel in The Shining. In that, and then we get that twist at the end where he's in the photo from years ago, and it's almost as if she's could possibly be in just an endless loop cycle there. Why is she drawn to that? Was she one of the ghouls that died X amount of years ago, 20, 30 years before or something?
Well, there's a scene there towards the end of the film where you see the ghouls, or sort of medium close up, these ghouls at Salt Air, and definitely one of them looks like Mary Henry, And is that Mary Henry now deceased, or is that Mary Henry years ago, or did she ever exist at all, or does she exist now, or did she exist many years ago? So there's that element.
Well, speaking of the ghouls, I mentioned earlier, there was one scene that as a kid really, freaked me out, and it's the one where, she's in the boarding house and she looks down the stairs, and then you see just the man, the white-faced guy, ghoul, just looking up at her. And I thought that was really chilling. I think, again, it's minimal makeup, but it's very effective. And even George Romero, basically used that same style for Night of the Living Dead. It's low-key and effective. So.
Well, he uses the tactic too. I think she's looking in the mirror and she's dreaming of hands on her, like it might be Mr. Linden, and it turns out to be the man. And so you get that classic thing where the character thinks it's one thing happening, but then we see, it's really something different. And so again, you get that sort of schizoid split from what's seemingly happening in reality, and the diegetic reality of the film, from what the character thinks is happening.
And the same with Dr. Samuels in his office as well.
And,
but that may indeed go back to this connection with the man, but he's a manifestation of the rest of the ghouls. And of course, because the Salt Air Amusement Park is this, even though it features a couple of scenes, but doesn't feature in that many scenes. But I think that's kind of even a central character within itself. I think is Salt Air Amusement Park, because she's continually sort of Mary drawn back to that environment, that dilapidated amusement park, and those ghouls within Salt Air. So, and the man is the catalyst for that, of course. I just going to talk maybe a little bit more about The Hitchhiker. I haven't seen The Hitchhiker for a long time. I was hoping to see it again yesterday. I didn't have a chance, but you guys familiar with the Twilight Zone Hitchhiker? Because I mean, there are, I think, definite similarities between The Hitchhiker and Carnival Souls. I think Carnival Souls has been talked about as a feature-length, almost a kind of a feature-length Twilight Zone episode in itself. But my memory of the Hitchhiker is Inga Stevens is she's on a road. There's been a car accident. You never see that. I think the opening scene may be the car at the side of the road. She's on the phone. I think she's on the phone to her mother. Correct me if I'm wrong. She's saying, I'm okay. I've had this accident, but everything's all right. I'm going to continue my journey. So seemingly she continues a journey, and it doesn't matter how far she goes. There's always this man, this kind of disheveled little Asian-looking guy who's always ahead of her. And that, of course, could be construed as kind of death reaching out to her. So, but if you sort of make those comparisons between that character in The Hitchhiker and the man, there's definite similarities between that. So whether or not Herc Harvey was influenced by The Hitchhiker.
Because the episode came out only like 2 years before this movie.
Yeah,
and,
it was set, but it's certainly a definite correlation between those two.
And I mentioned earlier an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge because that's the exact same thing. I mean, the Civil War Confederate officers about to be hanged.
Which later became a Twilight Zone episode from a French short film.
Yes, exactly. And and then the rope breaks and he gets away and he goes home and everything lives happily ever after. And then all of a sudden you hear, him, he falls because he just thought of all that in the last minute of his life. Yeah. And that's very much the same thing in Carnival of Souls.
So that could be coincidental too, because I think the French short film came out in '62. However, someone like Herc Harvey could have read Ambrose Bierce's book, which had been around since 1890. So maybe he could have possibly got the idea from the book. I'm not sure exactly the time frame as the in terms of the film coming out, the short film. Didn't it win Best Short Film at Cannes in 1962?
It did,
anyway,
I
and Carnival of Souls also 62. So, could be coincidental, maybe not. But yeah, there's definitely a correlation between the two. But that short film is a brilliant film. I looked at it again the other day. I hadn't seen it for years, and 26 minutes or something, but it's just brilliant, yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the more technical aspects, pro and con, about the film. And let's start with the acting. Basically, there are three what you'd call main characters. There's Mary, there's the man, and then there's Lyndon, I guess, as the sort of competing part of that triad. So let's talk about Mary first, obviously. I think, this is not a film that, in a sense, needs to be carried by great acting. It's the mood, the writing, the little coincidences that we've mentioned that may or may not have been intended. But I think Candice Hilligoss, who has a very short IMDb acting credits list, only a handful, does a great job. And the thing I want to just point out before I hand it to you guys, I saw that she was married to a guy named Nicholas Costa, who is a well-known American soap opera actor who often played deranged characters, psychopaths, guys who stalk criminals. So it's just interesting that she was married to a guy who is a well-known Canadian American character actor who played really often demented and psychotic characters.
Yeah, I think Candice Hilligoss is. I think I read she's like the only professional in the cast. She'd studied with Lee Strasberg and such. And I think she's wonderful in the movie. Yes. And it would have been nice to see her in more stuff. Apparently, the money she made from this movie supported her and her husband until he got going, and we didn't see much of her. I thought it was interesting reading. I didn't know this till real recent that she wrote a sequel for this movie years after the fact. And shopped it around, and the producer she gave it to decided, hey, yeah, we should do another one, but instead of your script, I'm just going to do a remake. And it was like 1997, 98, and I mean, who remembers it? It's apparently, I never saw it. Apparently,
there was one, and it starred one of those, not Juliette Lewis, but there was another. There was another actress with an on it, but it had
Tony Smith.
Right. Yeah. It had the same name, but it was a totally different movie. And I remember I got it in a CD that I had ordered, like of it, thinking it was a remake just to see it. And I was like, what the hell is this?
But yeah, Candice Hilligoss, look, I think it was I'm not sure how it all came about, you guys may know, but I think it's a very good move on Herc Harvey's part to get somebody that had some acting experience, and as you mentioned, Matt, the Actors Studio and so forth, Lee Strasberg, and you needed some professionalism in that particular role. And I think it works really well, and I think she's really quite good in that role. because she has to. It's a difficult character to play as well because she's so detached from most of the film, and yet she has to sort of project this detachedness, if that makes any sense, and the fact that psychologically there is a lot happening underneath in a fairly disturbing way. So a difficult role, but and the need for a professional actor was a great choice, I think.
And by the
and
way,
I don't notice with the rest of the actors at all. I mean, they do. Yeah, they do a reasonable job. It's all what's needed, really. It's all about Mary.
and by the way, it was Shawnee Smith, not Tawny. Just in that
Yeah,
sequel.
Johnny. Uh-huh.
But yeah, it's interesting how her career didn't really take off. I'm not sure why that is. I don't really know enough about Candice Hilligoss's background. I know that she's still with us.
Yeah.
I have Facebook pages, and it's mostly about people still praising her role in Carnival Souls, which is fine. That's fantastic. And she's about 85 or 86, and I think she's the only member of the cast left now. I mean, Sidney Berger's gone, unfortunately. So, and of course, Herc Harvey, John Clifford, the writer, they're all gone now. So that's why it's interesting to see the reunion in, I think, late 1989. I had a quick look at that again. And,
I saw that,
I think, there's a certain amount of perplexement within the cast that, how could this low-budget horror film we made so many years ago sort of be returned and revitalised? And, I mean, they're very grateful for it, but they're sort of perplexed at the same time, I think. But, the influence, too, on younger directors, directors like David Lynch, you mentioned, Matt, and possibly other directors as well, is enduring. And because, as I mentioned at the beginning, what you can achieve from such a low budget with imagination, it's all about imagination, and it's a good story. It's a really good story, and I think, a multi-layered story. So you don't necessarily need a big budget, but you need the imagination, and you need a good narrative. You need good writing, and I think that's what Carnival Souls has got.
And Berger, what is your take on Berger, Matt?
I'm sorry, who?
What is your take on Berger's performance, Sidney Berger?
Oh, well, considering I couldn't stand the guy, I'm sure he did wonderful. And in fact, when you see the eye peeking through, you kind of want to on the loo moment of somebody taking a razor to it because he's such an annoying character. No, I thought everybody, they're more amateurish, but I thought they did the roles well. I thought the guy who played the priest was, especially in the scene when he's all shocked at her playing that. Weird music and throwing her out and sputtering and all. I thought everybody did well. And Herc Harvey he doesn't do anything but stand there, but he's perfect. He's got a great look for that. I think it's interesting. I was reading up on him, and he, you always hear like he worked for an industrial company. This was his only feature film. You think like, oh, one and done. And it's like he had experience. It was like he was a theater major. He even played Stanley Kowalski at one point. He directed, so it wasn't like he was just some novice filmmaker. And then he made all those industrial films, like stuff on how to use a chainsaw properly and fun things. So he was experienced, and I think you could see that some in the movie. There's some nice little touches, like if I remember right, there's like a scene where you just see her hand on the car radio knobs, and you get to see the hand on the organ keys, and that's something you expect in a good movie. That's a really nice touch, and that's not just some Ed Wood fumbling around. I mean, that's real smarts behind that.
Absolutely, no, he's experienced. Rod's experience with industrial short filmmaking, definitely to a feature like Carnival of Souls, and you mentioned the radio too, Matt. I mean, an early scene too, and I played this in classes, cinema classes, and to younger students, and they still find it really quite eerie and quite unsettling. Is the scene when Mary's driving, it's at night, it's the first time we see the man, she's fiddling with a radio in the car in front of her, up and down the dial, but the music is playing, this organ music, we'll get to that, I'm sure, and that appears to be playing in her head, because no matter what she does to the radio dial in the car, that doesn't change the music. Mm-hmm. And I think those touches in terms of, and of course the man appears outside the car, and the use of lighting and all that is really quite sophisticated in terms of a B-grade horror film, you know.
Well, also too that she's a church organist, but I believe she drops her shoes and she's sort of fondling the pedals with her feet. So there's a sexual aspect to that. You have these big pipes here, and you have this woman's feet sort of touching down below. So there's this. So I think that's something that probably the pastor probably picked up on as well. She seems to be in the midst of sexual, if not climax, in sexual fondling or foreplay.
That's a great point, Dan. And interesting, that scene where she kicks off her shoes and is playing with her bare feet. The editing, if we talk about technique, the editing speed, the whole film in terms of the editing speeds up, and the rhythm of the film speeds up. And that's quite cleverly done. Again, for this low budget, keep saying it, for this low budget horror film. And that really adds to that, off-kilterness, tension. And there's a scene where just after that particular, or during the organ scene, where the visual style is spinning around,
Yeah.
And it's really quite clever, Again, going back to what we were saying about Herc Harvey's kind of smart
overhead shots. I mean,
it's right at the beginning, the credits.
Psycho, when Martin Balsam gets killed on the stairs, you get this God's eye view, and you get some of those sort of shots here too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And it gets that disorienting effect because she seems to be in rapture in that moment, literally.
Well, yeah, maybe some sort of rapture or some sort of I don't know whether it's possessed. She's possessed, I think, maybe in some way. Possessed by who or what?
Yeah, and then goes the frigidity that you think she has throughout the movie. She's not frigid all the time, obviously.
Right.
She may get worked up.
Keys with her feet very, very well, but that, of course, segues into, and there's a great scene there, right at the entrance of the church, long shot, where you see the man kind of slide in, and that is a great shot too, I think. And but the previous kind of scenes have been building up to that. Really, it's the entrance of the man again, who's always behind and never far away, of course.
Well,
I love the hitchhiker. Yeah. Hitchhiker. It's always this man in front of Inga Stevens.
Yeah.
She can't escape him, but he's always in front of her, no matter how she drives. Whereas the man slips in at various points in different contexts during Carnival Silence Band.
Well,
but score, is really such a key element of that film. That prevailing organ score, and that really, I think, sort of adds to the eeriness and otherworldliness. I think that the word otherworldly really applies, I think, to Carnival Souls, because as we said at the beginning of the discussion, there's a lot of just scenes with Mary driving around Kansas, kind of normal, so-called normal scenes, but nothing appears to be completely normal. And the organ score really adds that element to the film.
And that's the music. I mean, there's no real theme music for the most part. It's just you just hear this organ music throughout the movie. It really is a character in itself. It's
a masterstroke, really, I think.
I'm sorry.
Talk about the film. Of course, they'll talk about Mary and the visual style and all that, but they'll mention the organ score. They'll always mention that, and that sticks in your head as well. And it's so, as it is to many films, like it's the music or the score is just so vital,
Mm-hmm.
And the visual style, which I guess we'll get to as well. I know nothing about the cinema. You might, the cinematographer at all, or the composer. Gene Moore is the composer. Maurice Prather is the cinematographer. I don't know anything about him, but the cinematography, is really that. Of course, adds to that eeriness and otherworldliness in the film, and particularly the scenes around Saltaire, of course, as well, and that early scene in the car at night with Mary. The black and white visual style, almost kind of noirish.
Well, in that scene, you're expecting someone in the back seat, as in many gangster movies. That's someone's going to go, but he's outside. He's outside the window, and
exactly.
And unlike the hitchhiker episode, that personification of death is always standing out there. He's not actually literally within the window, seemingly going at 40 or 50 miles an hour or whatever she's doing.
Or and it's the scene where he's in front of her briefly as well, when she's at the side of the car. And whereas the hitchhiker we took, I just remember now the hitchhiker at the very end of the hitchhiker, I recall, this man, this disheveled Asian man is always in front of her. Then eventually she invites him into the car, and I think he sits in the back of the car. And that's virtually, or you can construe it as that, she's now met her death because he's actually slipping inside the car with her. Really.
And the black and white cinematography again, because again, that's part of the appeal of these type of movies like this, A Night of the Living Dead, is that it gives it that kind of eeriness that removes it from what we naturally see in color in the real world. And I can't swear on this, but I'm pretty sure I read that somebody made a colorized version of this, which is like the most moronic thing I've ever heard of. I mean, who'd want to see it? And it's almost as bad as the riff tracks people. They chose this movie to riff on, and it's like, I mean, they got a lot of bad movies on that Mystery Science, but every once in a while they pick a good movie, and it's just like, why? When there's so many bad ones out there, why are you picking a good movie to riff on? But anyway, I digress there.
But they try to colorize Casablanca and some of the other. There's a period there where they're colorizing films left, right, and center because they have the technology to do it. So, yeah, I have heard of it. I didn't go to the colorized version of Carnival Soul or the remake, but yeah, its influence. We've discussed that already, but it definitely has that endearing influence, and it still can affect. I can attest to this. It can affect the younger audience in a classroom. They're still intrigued by it, and that's part of the pacing of the film, particularly in these sort of key scenes like the earlier scene with Mary in the car, the build-up, and the fact that she gets out of the car. It's night. The man's appeared a couple of times, and again, this is really well paced because she seems to have car trouble. You think, God, what's going to happen next? She's on this lonely road. There's no one else around, but this ghoulish figure's just appeared. And then, to no ploy, but it works really well. She restarts the car again, and she's able to continue, but she's scarred, of course. But
I wanted to talk.
Looking at it as a purgatory movie, I think works too, because she's kind of like in this limbo and everything, and things aren't slightly working right. And again, the whole thing of being able to see some people and other people not hearing her. I think that's that's pretty much as plausible. I think a theory is that the whole thing was when she died, because and it ties into the whole Christian content of the movie too, with the church and the organ and all that. So I think that's another layer that's always really interesting to analyze.
Never mentioned in that article, which I should have, but I didn't, was the whole Catholic purgatory or analogy. Another little anecdote I read, or I think it was Urquhart we might have been talking about in that reunion, was there's a scene there where Mary goes into a department store and she tries on a dress, and again, she seems to be hearing things that nobody else can hear. And that was just a downtown department store, and they just went in there and they gave the customers a few bucks to say, look, we're going to shoot a scene here. Can you just sort of stay in the background? Here's $10 or whatever. And so, you don't get in the way of the frame. And they just filmed it really quickly. And the interesting thing about that scene, too, if you recall that scene in the department store, the woman who helps her is kind of odd. She seems to be wearing a wig. I thought at one stage she might even be a man, but I don't think she is. But her character is odd, a little bit odd as well. And then later on, when she meets Dr. Samuels, by chance in that park, there's a local there, an elderly gentleman that looks quite odd as well, seemingly normal but slightly odd. And he says something like, "Oh, I was only trying to help her," and then disappears. And the peripheral characters are interesting. And but I think one of the really great scenes, one of the best scenes in Carnival Souls, is the bus depot. And I really think that works particularly well when she sort of enters this bus depot. She's desperately trying to get away. She's been banished from the church, and she appears to have an opportunity. There's this otherworldly voice saying the East bus is leaving from gate 9, and as she gets onto the bus, then of course the bus is filled with ghouls. And again, their hands are reaching out to her. So.
And that plays into the dream thing too, where you often dream that you're trying to leave somewhere and you never can get away. and I think that adds to that aspect of the movie.
Can't leave, can't. Yeah, that's the way I approach the film.
Well, it's worth noting, I think, too, that it's just a few years earlier that the French New Wave hit, and this film is an interesting blend to me of the industrial filmmaking. That in the year 1985, people will live like this, that kind of thing that he was doing for a living, and also that rogue kind of filmmaking that the French and then the Japanese took up. Where they would just go in and they would just film whatever was happening. It gives that cinema verite feel. And some parts of this movie, even though it's a strange psychological interior B horror film, whatever you want to call it, does have that kind of cinema verite feel.
Oh, definitely, yeah. That influence. I digress a little bit, but there's a film called Blast of Silence. I don't know whether anybody's heard of that. You may have seen it. 1961. And that's a completely different film. It's not a horror film, but it's a first-time director whose name escapes me, but I think he animated one feature. But that's a fascinating film in the sense that I think it's definitely, I've written something on Blast of Silence, and that's definitely been influenced by French New Wave to some extent. It's about a hired killer who is losing his touch. He ends up looking up this woman he's had a relationship years ago, and it's not concentrating on the hit that he's got to do, and of course that's a fatal flaw. But just of course it's similar to Carnival Souls in the sense that the director also plays the main character in Blast of Silence. But if you're interested in film noir as such, which I'm sure you are.
Well, I think the Ingmar Bergman influence is really obvious when you take, my all-time favorite foreign language film is The Seventh Seal, and I think there's elements in this movie, you could believe that he was inspired by Bergman with that whole, death leading people along, and even movies like Wild Strawberries, just the whole reflecting on somebody's life. So I could definitely see that it wasn't just somebody being pretentious and saying, I'm going to make a European art film. He really did go to its influence.
In Wild Strawberries is the scene where the old man looks inside a coffin and sees himself in a dream sequence, a dream within the
nightmare having of his own death, premonition of his own death. Yeah. Oh, that's a great one. I hadn't thought about Wild Strawberries, but sure, and again, these directors like Herc Harvey, okay, they only made one feature, but they're well versed in filmmaking and the history of filmmaking. I think they had that love and that passion, so that maybe it wasn't necessarily a conscious thing, or maybe it was to sort of have a Bergman-esque sort of feel to the film. But they were aware of these films, obviously, Wild Strawberries and Seventh Seal, and also the director who made Blast of Silence. I think he's alluded to. The same kind of thing, the French New Wave and Bergman as well, even though Blast of Silence is a very, very low budget kind of late noir film, but it has these touches as well.
And then later after the fact with David Lynch, I think people have said there's elements of this movie that are like, Blue Velvet or Lost Highway with the guy with the white face. But it reminds me of my favorite Lynch film, which is Eraserhead, because
very much so.
That one obviously has a lot more effects and all, but it still has that same really creepy dream feeling. And again, that's a black and white movie. And, I just can't imagine it being in Technicolor and it having the same power.
There's one shot that I want to talk about because I think it's very influential, not only in horror films, but in other films. And that's the idea of when the ghouls start rising from the water and you see their faces coming out. And you can see that in Apocalypse Now in the final scenes before what's-his-face, Brando gets bumped off. You can see that in countless other films where some character is either rising from water or just rising above the edge of a table or something. And I think that's really an iconic and very dream nightmarish thing where something seems normal, but then the danger pops out of the normality. Do either of you want to comment on that particular shot?
Only that I read that it was filmed in a swimming pool, which is really funny. You take a lake or something really. No, it's just
it's an hotel or apartment swimming pool. Yeah, I was about to say something. Yeah, which adds to the brilliance of it in a way, the bizarre side of it. Yeah. I mean, so it's clever and economical and creative do that sort of. Well, how are we going to? We haven't got the budget to do what we would like to do in terms of filming that scene, but how can we do it to keep it within the budget and still make it look impressive? That's that sort of creativity, really. I think that comes
and it's really impressive, and it's really a good way to use that shot, because usually you think of action movies like Rambo or The Austrian Weekend, where people come jumping out of the water fast, just shooting away and all that. And like you say, Apocalypse Now would be the exception. It's very slow, and that's what makes this creepy. Is it's not real fast. It's like Nosferatu slowly rising up from his grave. It's just the slowness is part of the creepiness, which I think makes it even more effective.
Yeah, and yet the rhythm of the film, as I sort of mentioned earlier in the scene where Mary's becomes more frenzied playing the organ, the scene towards the end there where the ghouls are dancing and it appears to be Mary as part of it, the rhythm of the film speeds again. And that's a very clever touch to do that. Technically, it's quite ingenious, really.
Well, it's like a silent film. It speeds up to the sort of the way a silent, the Keystone Cops were never that fast.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. No, it's so the rhythm of the film, I think mostly, and rhythm is important. Maybe the Sydney Burger scenes kind of slow it a bit, but I think, as I said, that they're important scenes to flesh out Mary's character a bit more. So yeah, so you can see the reason behind those things too.
So I want to wrap this up. Just we've talked about certain things, so I want to give both of you a chance to point out any things that you wanted to speak about the film. So let me start with you, Peter. Ask you: are there any points that you'd like to point out that we haven't gotten to yet, and/or what are your final thoughts on the film? And then we'll go to Matt.
Thanks, Dan. Well, we probably covered it pretty thoroughly. However, the very last scene, the three women and Mary in the car, she appears to be dead, as do the other two women. But then again, you're never quite sure. Even to the very end of the film, that last scene, there's a certain question mark about whether Mary really or is she not dead? So, the film leaves you sort of questioning it right from the beginning to the end. And there's kind of symmetry too, because it's not the very beginning of the film where the car goes over, in the first few minutes of the film, and at the end of the film, again, is the car being sort of dredged up and Mary appearing to be dead. So, that symmetry is interesting, I think. Yeah, just in the final summation, I guess what I've already said, that, I don't think anybody would look at Carnival of Souls and say it was a masterpiece like The Seventh Seal or Wild Strawberries, but in the context of a very low-budget B-grade horror film, it's a cult classic. There's no question about it. And the enduring fascination we've mentioned, and I think, as I've said, it's to do with a narrative that's quite multi-layered and complex, and a psychological sort of fixation on the character of Mary Henry that makes it more than just a conventional horror film. Much, much more, I think. Mm-hmm. That's how I would look at it. Yeah.
And how about you, Matt? Is there anything you want to point out about the movie that we didn't? And what are your final thoughts on the film?
I think we pretty much covered it. I was thinking more of Herc Harvey. He had more interest in life than people I think gave him credit for, and it would have been interesting to see him make more movies. Apparently, he tried to make more, but it just didn't work out. But I just think I love it when a movie. If I like it, I don't like it, who cares? But I like when a movie that I admire finds its following over the years. It's really interesting how this movie was just, it was like the part of a double bill with a Lon Chaney Jr. movie. Nobody saw it. And then, because of TV, because of all those late night showings, people were just like, whoa, what is this? And then over time, and luckily before Herc Harvey passed away, so he got to see some of it, people began to appreciate it. And then they had the as you say, the gathering with all of them, where apparently he went in his white makeup, which would have been quite the sight. So anyway, it's one of those what ifs. What if he had been able to make more movies? It would have been fascinating to see. And as far as this one goes, it's I can just be repeating myself that it's so good because of the low budget. I don't think it would work, and that's probably why the one I didn't see the remake. It's probably awful because it's probably in color and higher budget. But this one, just by keeping it to the ground with the guerrilla style filmmaking, with all the rawness, grittiness, I think that's what really gives it that atmosphere, and I think that's what people remember the most about it.
Let me just ask both of you questions that came to my mind. Final question. Do you think it would be easier now, 60 years, almost 60 years later, for small, low-budget films to find an audience on the various streaming platforms? Because this film basically was rescued by the just inadvertent fact that Harvey did not put the copyright seal on the American version of the film. If that hadn't happened, it could have been one of those films that just rotted away, you know, and got destroyed in some canisters in Kansas. Do you think it's easier today for, let's say, if a film of this caliber, you know, a low budget film that has some quality, is it easier today for a Carnival of Souls to make it, or not, do you think?
I don't think so, because now there's such a glut of movies that are easier to access through every streaming thing. You know, I go on Amazon Prime, and there are literally hundreds of horror movies I never even heard of. And when you do, I mean, I guess people who are real connoisseurs maybe know some of these, but when you think of the horror movies that people know today, it's the big budget stuff. It's the studio stuff. It's all the James Wan stuff. So I mean, a movie would have to be really special and I don't know, unique to really make it if it was a no budget movie that's just one of the millions crammed on Netflix and Amazon Prime.
I totally agree with Matt. I mean, you're just sort of bombarded with so much that it's very difficult, I think, extremely difficult these days to sort of to cut through that. And but I totally agree too with what you're saying, Matt, about part of the enduring quality with Carnival Souls is its history as well. The film itself, obviously, but just this fascinating history, which is quite extraordinary, really, and how it was disappeared quite quickly, then was resurrected, and through late night TV viewings, and this build up of this cult following, and it's a great story, and that's part of its enduring quality as well, for sure.
Well,
I think.
I'll link to Film Frenzy below this video, as well as your university website, Peter. And I want to thank you both for spending a little over an hour talking about this film. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Dan.